Imagine being out and about with an attractive woman, your ideal type, in fact. At this point, you've been talking for hours and things seem to be going really well. The conversation is great. You have the same sense of humor. And in general, the vibes are immaculate. Your confidence is at an all-time high, and you feel like you could do no wrong. She's even laughing at your corniest jokes. So naturally, you decide that it's time to take the next step. It's time to test out your physical compatibility. It's a risky move you're about to make, but all the signs are telling you to proceed. You try to make a move on her, and that's when it happens. She physically pulls back and gives you a weird, confused look, almost like you had just done something worth going to jail for. What did you do? What went wrong? Did you misinterpret her signals?
Every red-blooded masculine male understands how much it stings to have your sexual advances rejected by a woman, especially when it's a woman that you genuinely thought you were making progress with, right? Sexual escalation in general is one of those parts of the game, one of those topics within social dynamics in general that's very tricky because it almost feels like you're walking a tightrope. It almost feels like you're crawling through a minefield. One little mistake and everything blows up in your face, right? Because how do you reconcile the two? You can't necessarily just spring up sexual energy on a woman out of nowhere because then you might genuinely creep her out. You might be going a little too fast or just in general look a little too eager, too thirsty. At the same time, though, you can't not create any room for sexual tension because then that's you being on the highway to the friend zone, right? If you create no sexual tension or sexual urgency at all, then sex is just not going to happen. So how do you balance the two? How do you marry the two? How do you make that seamless, smooth transition from regular conversation to a woman, especially a woman you just met, to a sexual conversation, all the way to sexual activity? Well, I've come up with three very simple principles for you today for just sexual escalation in general. Three things that you need for understanding how to take a woman from one point of regular conversation to another of sexual conversation to the point where you get to realize or materialize your sexual tension that you've now created with her. This is the how to create tension in a sexual way, sexual tension guide, if you will. Right. So let's talk about it. Before we get proper into these three very simple principles of sexual escalation, you first have to understand the very interesting but very common mistake you're probably making with sexual escalation, right? In order to know how to do the right thing, in order to do the right thing and do it correctly, you must first remove the bad habits, right? So you have to replace the bad habits with the good ones, but first you have to identify the bad habits and get rid of them. And usually it's only ever this one major mistake you're making with sexual escalation in general. And that's the fact that you're doing something that I like to call hiding your balls. I'm saying it again. You're hiding your balls. You see, the thing about sexual escalation in general and all these three principles that we're going to be discussing in detail is that they look a certain way. They look a certain kind of way upon regular appearance, right? And they look the way they do precisely because of this particular mistake right here. The rest of this video is going to make a lot more sense to you if you can first understand this and remove it and understand that these three principles we're going to be discussing really just revolve around helping you with this problem. Because here's the thing. You see the way I've been talking about sexual escalation so far? That's the way a lot of men interpret sexual escalation, which is first I have to have a regular conversation with a girl to not arouse any suspicion, to not trigger off any of her defense mechanisms. And then I have to kind of sneak past her defense mechanisms to get to the point where I can now start being sexual with her. The problem with that kind of thinking is that that goes directly against what sexual escalation is and what it means to be sexy. You see, if you think that the way to create sexual tension with a woman is to kind of tiptoe around it, or to try to find your perfect moment for it, or to sneak past her defenses in any kind of way. Then you have a misconception here. You have a misunderstanding of how this works. The truth about sexual tension, the creation of sexual tension to begin with, is that it's something you have to do from the jump. It is something that needs to be introduced very early, very quickly, from the jump. And this is regardless of whether you're having a direct approach or indirect approach to a woman. She has to know from the jump that you are a man with sexual capabilities and two set of balls. She has to be consciously aware, not just unconsciously, but consciously aware that you are a, to some degree, sexual threat to her. If that doesn't exist to begin with, then you cannot create any sexual tension. Again, if you haven't watched my video on how tension works in general, I advise you to go here to really understand how tension works. But as a quick refresher, tension is something that is created when you have two opposing emotions creating a spark. That is why we call it a spark of attraction, because tension is a prerequisite for attraction. How can she genuinely feel tension around you to any capacity if she doesn't feel a mix of emotions around you? A mix of emotions around the possibility of, in this case, of sex, right? So you can't be a sexual threat if you're nothing but Mr. Goody Two Shoes all the time. Mr. I'm gonna hide my balls and dick from you. Mr. I am not a sexual threat to you. You can't create sexual tension to begin with if you try to do that. You have to start out being a sexual threat, right? Which is why the very first principle of sexual escalation is gonna be be a source of validation. This is the most important step, number one. Without this step, you're not really getting too far with a woman, right? If she doesn't see you, right? Let's say this is you, this is her. As usual, her hair is wavy or curly, and her head is bigger than yours. If she doesn't, to some degree, put you on some kind of psychological pedestal, then everything you do from that point on isn't going to mean much to her. You see, the ability to control how she perceives you and how she sees you and how she thinks about you is a big part of how game works. And the reason for that is because when you have control over the narrative, then you have control over her emotions, which also means you have control over her actions. Because women act from a place of emotion. So if you control the emotion, you control the action. Keep that in mind. Just write that here just in case you forget for later. If you want to control a woman's emotion, you have to control her action. E equals A for women. That's how it works for them. And the point to that is she needs to see you as someone or something, if you will, that can invoke emotion in her that will inspire her to action. That is what being a source of validation is all about. It's being the kind of person that she is willing and eager to seek validation from. That is the first, most fundamental, most important step to sexual escalation. If she doesn't feel the need to be validated by you, then escalating with you sexually not only means nothing to her, but is a detriment to her on a biological level. You see, don't forget, we're still dealing with evolutionary psychology here. She has to see you from an evolutionary psychology point of view as someone with ample SNR value, that is survival and replication value, or mostly survival value because that's the one that men focus on and provide the most to women, but you get the point. She has to see you as a worthy suitor and candidate for her ability to help you, procreate, right? That's kind of the exchange going on there. If she doesn't see you as someone that it in her mind is a good idea to escalate with, then the chances of her doing that are just flat out zero, right? So the first thing is be a source of validation. How do you do that? Well, there's actually two very simple ways you can do that. Two very simple ways. Number one, you want to make sure that in the way of being a source of validation, you're making sure that your physical touch is scarce. Sexual escalation of all kind will always start with physical touch. It'll always start with your ability to make physical contact with the woman in question, right? And that's part of why sexual escalation in general is such an awkward thing to do and to accomplish, because it involves essentially breaking the touch barrier and doing something that might be seen as at the edge of what is societally accepted, right? Being able to get past that touch barrier, so to speak, is a big part of how you begin physical escalation, sexual escalation. But you must be a source of validation to her, which means you can't be the one that's more eager to touch her than she is to touch you. You have to make her the more eager party here, right? How do you accomplish that? Number one, make sure that you are going out of your way to make your physical touch scarce. I always say, touching you, right, in general, should be a massive deal for her. Massive deal. It should feel like God Himself is paying special attention to her. And that's how it should feel, not just with your physical touch, but with everything. Everything you do around her should feel like some form of validation. Eye contact, replying her text, giving her a compliment, anything, your time, your attention, undivided attention, your presence, physical presence, everything about you, as long as it is directed towards her specifically, should genuinely feel like massive validation. And the only way you can make it feel like that is, again, step one, make sure it's scarce to begin with. If you give all these things freely all the time, then what motivation does she have to work for them? Where's the sense of urgency? There's none. And that's the point. That's why that's number one. Number one, make sure that your physical touch, especially your physical touch, is scarce. What's number two? Number two goes off of number one. Number two is, in the way of physical touch, make sure. Where's my other pencil? Did I drop it already? Oh, not dumbass. I had it her the whole time. On my second hand. Can you believe that? Anyway, number two. Number two, make sure that she pays for your physical touch. Make sure that if you are going to touch her, the moment you've decided that you're going to make physical contact with her, that she actually gives you something in return for it. It's very important. You're not only obeying the law of transactionality according to the laws of the game, but also you're establishing a frame in her mind that lets her know that the only way that she can get that level of physical validation from you is to do something for it, is to earn it. Very important. Don't forget the creature we're dealing with here. We're dealing with women. As a creature, and this is something that they can't help, so don't be mad at them and don't be angry with them about this, right? This is something that you shouldn't be emotionally invested in. But as a creature, by their very design, this is something they can't help on an unconscious level. They perceive value through both scarcity, which we discussed in number one, and effort. How much they have to work to earn the value. Right? So it's impossible for a woman to see you as valuable if, one, she doesn't have to go out of her way to attain you to some degree, either compete with others or seek you out because you're so elusive and scarce. And B, she has to make sure that she puts in effort. If she doesn't put in effort, she doesn't see you as valuable. She doesn't feel like she had to work for you, then you're not valuable. So that's the most important one right there. Number two, make sure she's putting in effort. Even if you don't get the scarcity part right, it doesn't matter. As long as you get the effort part down, you're straight. So make sure that she's putting in effort for physical touch. A good example that I can give you, just as something you can understand, is And this is something I noticed about myself from just years of talking to women. I have this very interesting habit. And I only discovered it very recently, by the way, because I've been going through my own infield and stuff. But I noticed that whenever I walk up to a woman and use my opener, right after I use my opener, that's usually when I'll go, by the way, what's your name? Right? While they're still in a nice daze, still confused, usually after a nice push pull, after I say something that makes them, again, feel tension to opposing emotions. You have very beautiful, beautiful teeth. I don't know why your mouth is shaped like that, but your teeth are gorgeous. Thank you. They're nice and confused. Then I go, by the way, what's your name? Right. Right after I say what's your name, what I usually do is I wait for them to give me their name. That would be the compliance test and the compliance afterwards. So I'm asking them for compliance. What is your name? Then they give me their name. That'll be them complying. Then, and this is something I just discovered about myself, I reward that by going, nice to meet you. I'm so and so. Nice to meet you. I'm Jason. Right? That's a very subtle example, but a very good example of I'm not necessarily giving them the right or the permission to have physical contact with me until and unless they've given me a certain degree of compliance. You see how that works? So, just something to keep in mind. You can extrapolate this into any other part of the game, really. You can tease her, for instance, or disqualify her, and then when she qualifies herself to you, when she goes out of her way to explain herself to you and backtrack for you or whatever, then you can give her a little bit of a physical touch, a nudge on the shoulder, a punch on the arm, um grab her hands, kiss it, whatever you want to do, just something to let her know and acknowledge on a physical level that you appreciate the compliance that she's given you. Reward her for her compliance accordingly. Okay. Don't forget, if you don't reward compliance, they're not likely to comply next time. The reason they keep complying to your request and keep complying to you in general is because they feel good every time they do, which is why it's important to reward compliance. Pay them for their compliance with your physical touch. And all that'll do is increase the stock value of your physical touch. See how that works? A beautiful system. So that's the first principle in general, be a source of validation. What will be the second principle of sexual and physical escalation? That would be, I still got some life on this. It is not a big deal. This is one of those covert ones, but it's very important because this is the one that deals with the way you perceive physical escalation in general. And as a result, will change the way your brain chemistry works around it. A big reason sexual escalation is so difficult for a lot of men is because they genuinely put a lot of importance on it. And they put a lot of importance on it usually because of what they perceive to be the adverse consequences of not doing it correctly, which is fair, right? There's a lot of men out there that have suffered a lot of things because they didn't sexually escalate properly or did it at the wrong time or did it with the wrong girl, whatever the case may be, right? You have the era of Me Too. Remember that whole thing that was happening? Okay, cool. These are valid, whatever. Here's the thing though. The reason men get in trouble with sexual escalation in general is precisely because they see it as a big deal. That's what no one seems to understand. It goes back to the fundamental law of the game, the law of expectation. If you make it a big deal, if you expect it to be a big deal, then it is a big deal. It's really that simple. Combine that with the law of mirroring, which is the fact that women mirror your behavior, they're reactionary creatures, which is a fundamental law of female nature, right? And what you have is a cocktail for disaster. Because you make it a big deal, then they make it a big deal. And because they make it a big deal, now it is a big deal. Now, two people have agreed on one thing, and now a matter is established. Two different sets of eyes are observing the same thing, which makes it more real, right? The same thing is happening with sexual escalation. If you make it a big deal, it becomes a big deal. Touching a woman to any capacity should never be a big deal. I always say it should be a big deal for her. For her, touching you, getting physical contact from you should be like the sun and moon have kissed her on the cheek, right? It should feel like the Red Sea has opened up to her. She should feel like Moses with that staff, right? But for you, It should feel like taking a shit. You do it, you probably scroll on TikTok while you're doing it. It's not a big deal. It's not a big deal. How do you make sure that you don't make touching a woman or escalating with a woman to any capacity a big deal? It's actually very simple. Can I write it there? I'm gonna write it there at the bottom actually. That's it. Be playful. That's all it is. Always remember, it should be a playful thing. Touching a woman to any capacity, especially for the first time, should always be done from a place of playfulness. It's playful. It's fun. It's fun to do. It's not that big a deal, right? If there's one thing I've always championed and really excelled at when it comes to game, especially since coming to America about a decade ago now, is this part: being playful and escalating in a playful way. Why? Because fair point, I come from a country where the touch barrier doesn't exist. Right? I was born and raised in Nigeria. No one is worried about a personal bubble where I'm from. So it was very easy for me to always break people's touch barrier because I never discovered that there was one until a long time passed. And even then, I was still getting away with it because I could just play the "I'm Nigerian" card, right? "Oh, I don't know what you're talking about. Touch barrier. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was making you uncomfortable. I just, in my country, this is how we greet each other," which is true, by the way. It wasn't like I was lying about it, even though I consciously knew that I could be a little more socially calibrated. I just chose not to be because it's dumb, it's goofy. Touch barrier, stop it. It's not a big deal, right? It's not a big deal. You can be playful, you can be fun. Now I'm not saying, right, don't go to the other extreme and just like start poking people in the eyes and shit. Don't have to do that. But understand, you can't allow it to become this massive thing in your head. If you allow that to be the case, then you start doing a lot of bad things unconsciously, including hesitating. Hesitation is probably an enemy of good sexual escalation because when you act as if you're unsure about whether to touch or not to touch a woman, she can pick up on it. And that lack of confidence is, to say it in a way that YouTube will allow me to say it, it dries her up. Okay? There's nothing less attractive than that to a woman. A hesitant man, a man that is unsure, uncertainty in your body language like that. That pump faking, fainting like that. Oof. Gross. Terrible. Don't do that. All right? So always make sure that in your mind you're being playful and you're realizing that it's not a big deal. It's a big deal for her, right? Like we said in number 1, it should be a massive deal for her. But for you, regular Tuesday. Doesn't matter. All right. That's number 2. What's number 3? Number 3. Number 3 is the principle that makes all this more real to you. Call this the practical principle of physical escalation. And it's very simple. It's my favorite thing in the world when it comes to sexual escalation to talk about. Touch and go. Touch and go. Here's the thing. Here's how physical escalation works. The reason physical escalation is difficult, or at least one of the reasons it's very difficult for a lot of men, is because they're scared of the rejection that comes with it, right? And the reason you're more likely to get rejected when you're physically escalating, when you're touching a woman, right, making physical contact with her for the first time, is because you're going out of your way to make it awkward. Now, that's simple enough to say, but what exactly about the way you're doing it is making it awkward? It's actually very simple. It's time. You're prolonging the touch. And the longer the touch stays there, the more awkward things feel. The more awkward things feel, the more of a chance you give her to reject your advances. So it's really just managing the amount of time, the literal physical amount of time that you're leaving your touch for. I understand. You find her attractive. You want to touch her all over. She's very sexy. I get that. Right? With that said, you have to exercise some discipline here. Discipline is going to be your best friend. Understand that the best way to touch a woman and to physically escalate with a woman, especially one that you've just started getting to know, one that you've just started to get sexually escalated with, is you touch her and you remove your hand. You brush against her and you remove yourself. You make sure that each time you touch her, you don't leave the touch lingering long enough for her to have a chance to reject you. Don't forget the whole principle to this, the whole point to these principles, is the fact that you want her to genuinely think that touching you is a good thing. It's a good idea. It's not just a good idea, in fact, it's a great idea, right? It's not just something you want to get away with. It's not just something you want to do and then, you know, feel like you're kind of sneaking around doing it per se. It's something that you want in her mind for her to think, oh man, this is massive. This is amazing. I'm getting touched by him. Well, you cheapen the value of your touch if you just kind of leave it there. Again, go back to number one, scarcity. It's important. So the way you touch a woman has to reflect your value. The way you touch a woman has to reflect your value. If she feels like you will just keep touching her indiscriminately and she can just see and get to the point where she can be predicting your touch, your every move, then there's not a lot of value there for her, because you're clearly just another guy trying to find every opportunity to touch her, which cheapens your touch, which cheapens the value of it, you see. So the idea is to touch and to leave her wanting more. Touch and go, touch and go, touch and go. You can slowly increase the amount of time you're leaving your touch for. But for the most part, it should only be a fleeting feeling for her. She should think of each time you touch her as the heavens opening up to her. But it shouldn't last too long. That's the key. Scarcity is everything when it comes to touching women. Now, don't worry, there'll be a point where you're like literally inside her, right? So you can slowly, progressively leave your touch longer on her. That will happen. That's fine. But especially in the beginning, fleeting short touches, fleeting and short. And as a bonus, is something you could, pair up with this. Make sure that you're pairing your touch with verbal confirmation. What I mean by this is simple. It's better to touch her, and again, in a fleeting manner, when you're giving her positive reinforcement with your words. Goes back to that first example I gave you. Ask her for her name. She gives me the name. Cool. Nice to meet you. That's the verbal confirmation while I'm shaking her hand or while I'm receiving her hand. Might even kiss her hand if I'm feeling like a Casanova that day, right? Never know with me. When you're in conversation with her and she says something you like, maybe she qualifies herself to you. Oh, I actually went to NKU for business. Oh, that's lovely. Put your hand on her shoulder while you say it. I like intelligent women. Bring your hand back. I'm not leaving it there and staring into her eyes like a fucking creeper. Don't do that. Right? Verbal confirmation, physical touch to go with, withdraw both. And then just do that in sprinkles and little bits and pieces throughout your conversation with her until you get to the point where the very next physical touch that'll go with the verbal confirmation is you inside her. That's the thing. In case you haven't figured it out yet, all sex is, all getting naked with a woman is you rewarding her with physical touch. It's just a different kind or different degree of physical touch. But sex is just another physical touch. There really is no difference as far as the validation that women perceive goes, the validation scale they have in the back of their heads. There's no real difference between shaking her hand and being inside her. No, not really. It's different degrees of validation, obviously, but they're the same thing. Different parts of the spectrum, but still the same spectrum, right? Still the same graph, if I were to say, right? So that's really what it comes down to. These are the three principles that you have to keep in mind when it comes to physical escalation. Make sure your source of validation, be scarce, make her put in some effort for it. Um, make sure that your touch doesn't linger, right? Touch and go, touch and go. And then make sure it's not a big deal for you. Be playful. Be playful. Now, if you use all this and you do exactly what I'm telling you, and you keep these in mind while you're physically escalating with a woman, you will eventually get naked with her. This is inevitable. This is not even. I wish I could be humble and be like, well, it might work for you. It doesn't work. Nah, it will literally work for you every single time, as long as you're using these principles correctly. Again, it'll take some practice, right? It's not gonna work your very first time. You still got some nervousness and jitters to get over. You still have to learn to deal with the sexual anxiety that comes with the sexual tension, right? Because the more you sexually escalate, the more tension arises, the more anxiety that she feels, but then as a result, the more anxiety you feel. So a big part of this is getting used to that sexual anxiety, right? This is all part of it. It'll take some practice, but if you do it correctly, you will win every time. And then all of a sudden, having a girl advance towards you sexually isn't going to feel like that big a deal. And that's kind of where I want you to get to, right? Now, if you want to make sure that you are able to leave significant impact in a woman, both emotionally and psychologically, to the point where being with you is something that she will never forget for the rest of her life. And she can point back to you being with her in that way as one of the greatest decisions she's ever made and the thing she least regrets, then I highly recommend that you check out my course, Hypnotica, Erotica. This is a course that I made specifically for doing just that. This is the course of all courses when it comes to being a full guide for you, for knowing how to get a woman to see you as not just a sex god, but also the most consequential man she's ever been with. Because that's the whole point of sex, right? Sex isn't the end goal. It really isn't. But it is just about the most powerful tool we have at our disposal for getting women to become truly, completely, emotionally, and psychologically invested in us. So go check out Hypnotica Erotica when you get the chance. It's something that I've been working on for a while now, and it's come out great. And I'm already getting a lot of amazing reviews from people that are already in it. So go check it out before I have to increase the price, because I do have to increase the price. It's not something that I can keep out for just anyone and everyone to have, because the effectiveness, right, of those techniques that I teach in the course only really work when a handful of people in the world have them. If everyone has them, then it kind of defeats the point, right? So go check out Hypnotica Erotica. In the meantime, though, make sure that you're practicing your game, right? This is very important. This is usually where I'm supposed to say, go watch this video, go watch that video, or things like that. But I want you to understand that game is a verb, it's a doing word. It's something that you need to practice, it's something that you need to do. You need to actually see the results that I'm talking about for yourself in your life so that it becomes real to you, right? So please turn off YouTube, get the fuck out of here. Don't watch another video. I know they're probably trying to bring another one up here. Don't worry about it. Ignore it. Go outside and practice your game. Go and talk to beautiful women. Go and charm their pants off, and go and get amazing results and have amazing experiences. It's been Jason, favorite scientist. Do with all this information what you must.